What is going on, you guys? Missed the part here, back again with another alternate scenario video where we dive deep into alternate timelines and see how one minor change can change the course of history. I will be looking at the most insane Spider-Man moments, and that is Gwen Stacy's death. Peter Parker, after defeating Electro in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, thought that it was all over for him, but what he didn't know is that the fight was only just getting started. Harry became the Green Goblin, flying into the city, and would battle it out in the final act of the film, leading into Gwen Stacy's death. But what if this didn't happen? I'm going to be breaking down 4 alternate scenarios and analyzing each new timeline. This will be a shorter format of my fan fictions leading into some short stories, but do make sure to choose your path in the description down below with the timestamps, and do make sure to check out the 3 most recent videos on this series so you guys are all up to date with the latest content. But anyways, choose your path, guys. The biggest disappointing thing and shocking moment was when Spider-Man didn't get to Gwen in time, leading into him using his webs trying to save her, but it didn't work. That small choice Peter did in the final act of the film was the nail in the coffin for Gwen Stacy. This small choice changed the entire course of history, moving forward with the ending of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, as well as what could have been The Amazing Spider-Man 3. The death of Gwen needed to happen in Peter's life so he could move forward as a hero and a character. Peter became a better hero at the end of the film, becoming a hero once again, and he suited up to fight Rhino. But what if this didn't happen? The first scenario has been done on my channel to a certain extent, as well as the original 1977 What If comics, where Peter saves Gwen Stacy from the Green Goblin, where they fought at the George Washington Bridge in issue 121. Let's say in this branched reality, the events of the Clock Tower fight are still happening the same, and Green Goblin is about to choke out Peter. Gwen is screaming Peter's name, knowing that he is struggling to keep up, and she knows his focus just isn't fully there. Peter wraps a web around Harry's neck as he is flown to the wall, knocked out. Web Gwen was on snaps as Peter hears this. Instead of waiting a few seconds, our alternate timeline changes as Peter used his feet to kick himself forward in midair. He is able to get a few seconds in time to catch Gwen, and he catches her by the back, holding her by the neck and back as Peter is free falling fast. He uses his webs to move to the left side of the clock tower with a ton of speed and force, breaking through bricks and walls. He covers Gwen, and he does this as he falls hard to the ground, but it's been done and it worked. Peter saved Gwen in time, but he got severely damaged from the save, using more power in his legs. This small change would further change the timeline now, because Gwen was saved by Peter and they both would have a moment of happiness, and Peter yells at Gwen to get her out of here as he swings back to the clock tower and sees that nobody is there. That moment with Gwen and Peter gave Harry a small amount of time to leave the clock tower, escaping Peter's grasp. Peter looked everywhere, but Harry was already gone. He left the scene with his glider. This would make a huge impact on the current Amazing Spider-Man timeline since Harry isn't at Ravencroft. He wouldn't need to form his own team one by one, and Harry could do this in the shadows and strike at any moment in time in the city. Gwen in her new timeline still would move to England because of the big opportunity at Oxford, and Peter, like he said before, the battle with Electro, he would move on with her, moving to England to fight crime there as well. Harry wouldn't be seen after the events at the clock tower, and he would be plotting to recruit all his members with the help of the Gentleman at the end of the film. The Gentleman was that creepy guy in the trench coat and at the end of the original timeline, and since Harry isn't being watched in jail, he would be able to keep running the company in the shadows, but making it look like it wasn't him running the company. People in New York City would think Harry was killed and he would be missing, but the company would be taken over by other board members, and it would even be taken over by Felicia Hardy herself. Spider-Man stopped fighting crime, going overseas to fight in England, getting a better name for himself as he still would be with Gwen Stacy. They had a really good life, but Peter didn't learn those lessons at the end of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 with him moving on, so him taking another loss in this alternate timeline could even damage him even more, since the relationship with Gwen has even peaked more and even become stronger than it was ever before. Harry Osborn, after losing the battle, wanted to get revenge on Peter Parker because he felt betrayed and left left behind, turning into a monster like the Green Goblin. He had it built in his head that he was going to kill Spider-Man, and he created the Sinister Six. His team would consist of Vulture, Rhino, Doc Ock, Kraven, and even Venom himself. This team of villains would call Spider-Man out at the end of the film, but this time Spider-Man was in England and he wasn't showing himself in New York City. Gwen was at school and she ran home to see Peter staring at the TV screen, and she asked Peter who were they, and he didn't say anything. Peter would ignore Gwen, telling her that he was needed there, and Gwen took Peter by the shoulder, telling him that he needed to stay in England, but Peter told her that he couldn't shy away from his responsibility. The entire place of New York City would be like a war zone as it was destroyed by the Green Goblin, Rhino, Venom, and all of the other villains. Venom had webs in the city calling out Spider-Man to show himself. Peter started putting his suit on, getting his mask on, and Gwen told Peter not to do it and that he could die because there was only one of him and 6 of them. Peter thought to himself that Gwen was getting in the way of his true purpose of being a hero, and he knew that Uncle Ben would want him to do this, and he would want to help other people that couldn't help themselves. He liked England, but it wasn't the same for him, and he put his mask on, leaving. The Sinister Six would be defeated by Spider-Man in the morning as people cheered for him when he went into the city, getting a big welcome home. He was being beaten badly by all of the villains, but during the fight, Spider-Man punched Venom as the villain stopped in shock, seeing Peter's suit go from red to black, and his eyes tightened. Kraven knew he was more powerful and threw his spear at Spider-Man, but he dodged the attack using a symbiote whip, throwing it into Harry's glider as he went out of control, blowing up in the air. After he defeated them all, Venom would be the last one left on the team, and Spider-Man threw a car like him, almost like Web of Shadows, and Spider-Man threw it at him, killing Venom. And Spider-Man stayed in the city after he won. Peter changed back into his red suit, morphing. I really feel like what would happen going into the Amazing Spider-Man 3 universe with Gwen being alive is that Mary Jane and Eddie Brock would be dating, and Peter with the symbiote would kind of be like the Tobey Maguire Peter, acting less responsible, and maybe he would almost cheat on Gwen, but he wouldn't in this timeline. He would break up with her, staying in New York City fighting crime, as he would get a new love interest. Mary Jane and Eddie would be fighting, and MJ broke up with Eddie Brock as Peter saw this outside in the rain. He went to her aid in the movie, and they would go together. Peter still would remove the symbiote, and it would go onto Eddie Brock, and he would become Venom, fighting Peter at a football field like Ultimate Spider-Man. Peter would win the fight using his strength, defeating him. I would have to do a part 2 going into TASM 4 with Eddie and Peter teaming up to defeat Carnage, and it would actually be Uncle Ben's killer as Carnage. This would make it more personal for Peter, and he would try to kill Carnage, but Eddie stopped it and finished the job himself, and he would betray Spider-Man, and they would have a rematch at the end of the film with Venom winning at the end. Gwen was going to die either way after the events at the clock tower, and Peter was so caught up trying to fight the Green Goblin that he let his guard down, letting Gwen die. This is why he wasn't able to catch up to her like the 1977 What If comic, where Peter propels himself in the air, catching Gwen almost like he did in the first scenario. Peter dying in this timeline has to be early within the fight with Harry, and it would need to be fast. The only way this could happen while keeping Gwen alive is letting Gwen hold onto the webs during the fight. We can see that the webs break, but what if this didn't happen? What if the web had stayed intact and Peter didn't tie Harry's neck up with webs? This alters the current timeline a lot. Peter uses his webs and Gwen catches it as she is about to fall to her death, and she could see Peter is slowly losing the battle. Green Goblin starts choking Peter as he is trying to save Gwen and fight Harry at the same time, but it's no use. He kicks Goblin into a wall fast as he is thrown back to the clock tower in this alternate timeline. But in this alternate timeline, the clock tower hasn't broken, and it gives Gwen just a little bit of time to pull herself up with the web, and Peter sees Harry trying to get up, and he helps Gwen fast, and Gwen gets up to the clock tower in time. Peter uses his webs on Harry, but his glider smashes into the brick wall as Peter pushes Gwen to safety. The glider hits Peter as he is stabbed into the wall with knives from the glider. Harry starts laughing, seeing his friends slowly die, bleeding out, but then Harry's goblin serum would wear off a bit, and he starts crying and laughing, talking to himself. He said that he was sorry that everything happened happen this way, and Gwen was crying, but she would be knocked out by Harry. Green Goblin took the glider off of a dead Peter Parker as his body fell to the ground. Spider-Man would be dead in this alternate reality, and the universe was completely flipped as Gwen would be the one having a hard time moving on with Peter's death. Harry would battle himself out in his head knowing that he didn't want to kill Peter, but it would be too late and he slowly was going insane. He wouldn't be able to run the company as he would be exposed as the Green Goblin by other sources in Oscorp, as well as Gwen Stacy. Aunt May would learn Peter was Spider-Man and there would be a funeral for Peter in the city. This timeline could change going into alternate branched realities where we could have Miles Morales become the next Spider-Man fighting off Rhino and the Green Goblin, or we can have it where Oscorp would clone Peter and there would be a clone Sega storyline going forward with the Amazing Spider-Man 3 where Peter could learn that it was actually the clone that was killed and not him, so it would actually redeem Peter's death in this dark alternate timeline. There wouldn't be much of an ending for this universe where Peter dies in the Amazing Spider-Man 2 because it would be a shorter ending, and how it would end would be Rhino would rampage over the city, but the military would be able to stop him and they could completely shut down Oscorp within the 6-month period of Peter being killed. Gentleman would still be alive at the end of the film, but it would be unclear what he would do with Peter now being dead in this timeline. I think the most intense part of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was the final battle between Harry Osborn and Peter Parker. It was more personal, I think, than Peter versus Dr. Connors in the first film, because I feel like this one had a better relationship between the two characters. Peter didn't really know how to handle Harry, and it would be his downfall because he wanted to help him, but he didn't act fast enough, and because of this, Peter tried to use the lessons of Uncle Ben, and it just didn't fully work out at the end of the film. But what if it did, and what if Peter gave into complete power by killing his best friend to save Gwen Stacy? We all know that Peter wouldn't do this because he's not that type of person to chokehold somebody to death, but we're going to be looking at another alternate version of Peter's point of view, seeing why this moment in the film could actually happen in this alternate timeline. Now, in our new timeline, Peter gets up after the battle with Electro and he hears laughing in the distance echoing. Green Goblin shows up just like the original timeline, but this time Peter is quick to see that Harry is unstable, and as Gwen is about to be caught by Green Goblin, Peter yells telling her to duck, and she does. Green Goblin missed the opportunity and Peter used his webs kicking Green Goblin in the face. Harry was stunned, asking Peter why he betrayed him, and Peter told Harry that he could help him, but it would be too late. The fight wouldn't resort into the clock tower because Peter was able to prevent Harry from getting to Gwen, and Gwen would run into a safe location, getting out of the way. During the fight, Harry used a pumpkin bomb, blowing up parts of the area Gwen was in, and Peter became furious seeing Gwen on the ground coughing and hardly moving. Harry threw another one, but Peter caught it in time, using his webs to stick it on Harry's back, and Harry would blow up, rolling around on the ground. Peter started punching him to death, seeing Gwen was bleeding, and Gwen told Peter to stop as it echoed in the distance. But all Peter could think about was that fateful day when he let the robber go, and he knew that he couldn't let this happen again. Harry, with one last-ditch effort, detonated another bomb in his hand. Peter kicked it out of his hand as he jumped out of the way, and it killed Harry Osborn. Peter fell to the ground near Gwen as they both were almost killed. After the death of Harry, Oscorp changed powers being given to board members, and since that happened, people like the Gentleman wouldn't be able to get funding for the Sinister Six, since the company would be in good hands learning about what happened to Harry Osborn and how he became the Green Goblin. He would be exposed, and Spider-Man was called a murderer for this, being attacked by the news by the Daily Bugle. Rhino didn't get a suit at the end of the film, and Gwen would break up with Peter because of him killing Harry, but his excuse was that he was trying to protect her, and Peter moved on as Gwen moved to England, and Peter stopped being Spider-Man, having guilt for killing his best friend. Spider-Man became depressed, and he found the symbiote in the third film, using its powers to impress girls in his college classes. He became Venom fighting crime, and people in the city would be scared of Spider-Man. The Gentleman had to find another way to fight Spider-Man, and by doing this, he found Peter's Uncle Ben's killer, and once Peter found out about this, he became Venom, killing the killer. Gwen moved back to New York City to try to convince Peter to give up his power, but he lashed out at her. He became fully consumed by the symbiote, not being able to give in, and as he killed one person, he just kept going and going, not being able to get the full support by his friends and family, and he didn't really learn the lessons of the second film in the original timeline. The final fight between Electro and Spider-Man really could have changed in a fast way. If Peter didn't have Gwen by his side while fighting Electro, this timeline has to resort to Peter using his abilities to talk down Electro. Peter did this at the start of the film, but it backfired when a sniper shot at Electro, making him turn on the city. I feel like if Gwen didn't show up, there could have been some kind of conversation between Electro and Spider-Man, having no background interferences. This could have given us a true Spider-Man moment, with Spider-Man trying to redeem a evil person back into a good person. Peter, after swinging in the city, fought Electro for a bit as Gwen was still webbed up to the car. The police told her that she needed to stay there, and that was an order from Spider-Man. She broke out of the web, saying that she was going to help him, but they would put her in handcuffs, saying that it was for her own good. Peter, not having Gwen to stop Electro, changes the timeline because as the fight is playing out, Electro uses a massive blast as the clock tower is ticking for the planes to hit each other. And as a last resort, Peter tries pleading with Max, calling him by his real name, and Electro is shocked by this, and he sees Peter take his mask off, and he knows what he's doing is wrong, and Peter tries talking him down, explaining that he's been there with power and not being able to control it, and Electro still would be shocking Spider-Man, but Peter said that he needed him to be a hero and that good person one last time. And before all hope is lost, Max Dillon snapped out of it, and he looks at his hands. He couldn't even believe what he was doing, and he snapped back into reality. Peter got back up as Electro turned the power back on, and the planes could see one another again. He dropped to his knees crying, knowing that he became a monster, but Peter told him it wasn't too late and that he could come back. As this happened, Gwen was told by an officer that it was done and the power was back on, and Harry showed up, seeing Electro and Spider-Man. Peter put his mask back on as echoes of laughter were in the air. Harry looked at Electro, asking him why he didn't finish off Spider-Man, and he told Harry that he couldn't do it and that it was too much for him. Harry zoomed in, but he was stopped by lightning. Spider-Man asked Harry what happened, and Harry screamed, trying to kill Spider-Man, but there would be a massive 2-on-1 fight with Green Goblin. Harry wouldn't stand a chance, and he would be easily defeated. Electro was about to kill Harry, telling him that he was a liar and that he was going to finish this off once and for all, but Peter yelled, asking Electro to stop and end this all right here and right now, and he would. He teleported away as Peter screamed no, but it was already done. This small push led into Electro becoming a good person once again, becoming redeemed, and Harry, defeated on the ground, yelled and laughed at Spider-Man and told Peter that there would be another day to play again with a fair fight, and Peter webbed him up, and Harry was thrown in jail like the original Amazing Spider-Man timeline, and he would try forming the Sinister Six with the Gentleman. But Rhino, at the end of the movie, was easily stopped by Electro and Spider-Man teaming up in the city to fight crime. Gwen would go to England, and so would Peter. Electro would fight crime alone in New York City, and he would take on villains like Vulture and other characters. Harry would return in the third film with the Venom symbiote, and he would fight it out with Spider-Man, leading into Spider-Man getting the symbiote and removing it. Eddie would end up getting the symbiote at the end of the film, and there would be a 3-for-all fight with Harry Osborn fighting Eddie Brock and Peter Parker. But at the end of the film, Harry and Peter would team up, defeating Venom. And that is going to be my complete 4-scenario breakdown with what if Gwen Stacy had lived in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I feel like the first scenario and the last scenario were some of my favorites to write because redeeming Electro is something I feel like could have happened, and with Gwen still being alive, it really could have triggered something for future events, and it really would have changed Harry's plan for the Sinister Six if he wasn't thrown in jail. But anyways, as always, do make sure to subscribe, like, share, and request down below what kind of alternate scenario you would like to see. But anyways, do make sure to support the Patreon. Link will be in the description down below if you guys want to see fan fiction animations. But anyways, as always, thanks for tuning in, and have an amazing day.